Good evening, class. We're going to start diving into chapter 5 in our microeconomics class. But before we do, as I normally do, we're going to go back and review a couple of snippets from the previous chapter, chapter 4. And starting out in chapter 4, they talked about three markets. They talked about the market for computers, they talked about the market for gas and oil, and they talked about the market for stocks. And there were maybe not so many veins running through those discussions in the text, but there were some snippets like in the computer market, it's not nearly as volatile as gas and oil and stock, which most people understand. You've got OPEC trying to manage the supply of oil that's going onto the market and trying to drive and keep the price of oil up. So you remember, go back to your demand and supply curves and that little 2x2 that I've always told you to keep kind of in your back pocket. And that explains what at least what OPEC was trying to do, even though they couldn't play in the sandbox very well. And then we looked at the stock market, and the stock market, again, it goes back to, it's just a basic market that's bringing buyers and sellers together for shares of stock in, publicly traded, corporations. So that's, again, extremely volatile. One thing about the stock market is price and information, and it makes it a little different than the other two markets. Price and information is almost instantaneous. People are buying and selling, and as the sales are concluded and posted, information is coming in. And if you watch, on your iPhone or on your iPad or computer or whatever, the market is, especially if you look at the New York Stock Exchange, it's constantly up and down. Prices are constantly changing as buyers and sellers complete transactions. We also talked about government, when the government thinks that markets aren't necessarily efficient, or they think government officials think they know more about what's good for the basic population of the United States, and basically maybe we do. That's when the government starts playing in the sandbox, and they like to interject. And we talked for a few minutes about normative statements, and normative statements are basically how things should be. You think of normative statements, especially a lot in politics and government officials and policymakers and maybe social and welfare economics, and a lot of that is driven by normative statements because they're basing everything on how they think things should be. And on the flip side of that, you've got positive statements, and that's really how things are. And economists are more along the lines of that's how things are, because we're testing hypotheses, testing theories and laws, and we're trying to build models based on what the data tells us in an extremely complex world. But we're more along the lines of economists as how things really are, as opposed to policymakers and government officials who like to pontificate about how they think things should be. At least in their mind, that's how things should be. And then the government, we talked about a couple of things from the government's perspective. When they think that either a population is underprivileged and there's, it's not, housing and rent is not fairly distributed, or when prices may be too low, especially in the farming community, and they try to help boost those prices and kind of smooth out that revenue for especially your family farms. And we also talked about one of the government interventions that is probably near and dear to a lot of people, and that is the minimum wage rate. And the minimum wage rate falls into that category that's it's a price floor. It's illegal, unlawful to go below that price floor. But you and I both know that there are a lot of companies out there that are paying individuals to work for them below the wage rate, below the minimum wage rate. It happens. Maybe they're not getting caught, but that's the way it is. And so what happens typically with price floors is you end up with, at least initially, a surplus. And and we'll stick with the price floors for right now, but you've got the government again playing in the sandbox. So price floors, because they hold the prices higher, it negatively affects the consumer in their pocketbook when they go to buy, goods and services that are impacted by this price floor. And likewise, not only does it affect the prices we pay as consumers, but it's also, we're having to pay for it with taxes. So we're supporting these government policies and government strategies. And, all of us are taxpayers and we're paying taxes, and that's how government supports it. And then the flip side of that, you've got the price ceiling, and that's where you run into rent controls, especially in places like New York, New Jersey. There's several states that have it, but the price ceilings are more of I'll call it a local phenomenon. And if I looked on the internet, and I live in Atlanta, as I said, and Georgia doesn't have price ceilings or rent controls. The state of Tennessee doesn't have price ceilings or rent controls. And what it ends up, in a price ceiling and a rent control, you end up with a shortage. You don't have, individuals start, turning buildings into apartments. They start building apartments from scratch. And so you end up with a shortage, and they're setting that price ceiling below the equilibrium rate, and that's what ends up with a shortage, at least in the short run. And whether we're looking at price floors, we're looking at price ceilings, they're not necessarily equitable. And in a lot of instances, it doesn't help the individuals that the government thinks they're trying to help. So when we talk about the price floors, we said it didn't necessarily help the small family farmer. It seemed to send more and more support and more subsidy to the larger farms. And the same way with the price ceilings, because if you're in an area that has price ceilings, once you're in that apartment, they can't raise the rates. And what happens is a lot of times you have high income individuals that luck into one of those apartments. And once they get in, they dig in. And so they're being helped by these price ceilings, but the underprivileged and the low income and those that should be subsidized by the price ceilings, not necessarily happening. And then lastly, we talked about taxes, and taxes are there for one reason, and that's to fund the operational expenses of the government. And it doesn't matter whether it's the federal government, state government, county government, local government, and we ran through a bunch of the different taxes. You've got sales tax, you've got income tax, you've got property tax, you've got per head tax. And then we talked for a few minutes about excise taxes, and that's kind of pay at the pump. Excise taxes, most people think about gasoline and diesel fuel with excise tax, but also excise taxes on your cell phone plan, excise taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, and the excise taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, that kind of falls into that paternalism tax. And that's where Uncle Sam, at the federal level, or maybe even at the state level, policymakers decide they know more about what we should be doing than we do, even though individuals should know more about what drives their utility than the government does. So that kind of wraps it up on chapter 4. And we're going to jump into chapter 5. And chapter 5 is all about elasticity. And the definition they have in the book, it says elasticity is the ratio of the percentage change of one variable to the percentage change of another variable. And when I was in graduate school, I remember that, professors talking about, it's the ratio of the percentage change and the dependent variable, divided by the percentage change of the independent variable. But at the end of the day, it is a measure of responsiveness, and it's typically what we're going to talk about in this first go round. We're talking about it's the percentage change in the quantity demanded of a good or service divided by the percentage change in the price of that good or service. So with that in mind, it's the ratio is is, if I follow along with what the professors in graduate school taught us, that the quantity demanded is your dependent variable, and your price is your independent variable. So, and if you think about elasticity, again, if it comes out, if the ratio shows it's elastic, think about a rubber band. Think about something that's bendable and flexible. And if it ends up being inelastic, think about something that's highly rigid, something that's inflexible, something that's not going to change very much. And the ratio, and then there are several ratios in the text that you probably should familiarize yourself with, but and they use the little letter E for elasticity, and it'll talk about the elasticity. It's a percentage change in Y divided by the percentage change in X. And they've started using delta, and delta is the Greek letter for it's the Greek letter for delta, and or change. So that's where you see the little triangle, and that's the symbol for delta. Those of you in the class, you may be in a fraternity or maybe in a sorority. I'm sure you've had to recite the Greek alphabet. When I was in college and in a fraternity, we had the actives in the chapter, especially when you were pledging, they would take and you would strike a match, and you had to recite the Greek alphabet before the match burned down and burned your finger. So you became intimately familiar with the Greek alphabet, and you could recite that thing backwards and forwards. So I'm sure that delta and the little triangle, it's probably fairly familiar to many of you. So just kind of throw that in there. But and then the price elasticity of demand, and sometimes you'll see it. I can't remember if this textbook used it, but sometimes it will abbreviate, or they'll use the acronym PED, P-E-D, price elasticity of demand. So you'll see in some textbooks or some journal articles, you'll see PED, P-E-D, and that means that's the acronym for the price elasticity of demand. And when they talk about the price elasticity of demand, they talk about the percentage change in the quantity of a good or service demanded divided by the percentage change in the price of that good or service. And what does it throw in right at the end? All other things equal, all other things unchanged, ceteris paribus. And remember, I've been talking about ceteris paribus since we first started this micro class. And that is what economists have invoked for years, and they will continue to invoke it because it helps with control the complexity of the world that we try to live in. And so also remember, about this definition, they say the quantity of a good or service demanded. So remember, we're sliding. What are you talking about when quantity demanded? You're talking about sliding up and down that demand curve at different levels of quantities and prices. We're not talking about changes, at least with the price elasticity of demand. We're not talking about changes in shifting the demand curve, either increasing it or decreasing it. We're talking about sliding along that demand curve. So always keep that in mind. And they go on to say how much quantity demanded by consumers will change for each 1% change in the price. And one of the examples they used in the book, I think that the percentage change in price was 10%. So effectively, the text talks, or the authors talk about, that's a tenfold change, because you're looking at price elasticity, demand, or PED. It's measuring how the percentage change in quantity for a 1% change in price. And they will also take and I guess use notation. So PED is the price elasticity of demand, is usually notated by little e and a capital D. And they'll say equals to the percent change in quantity demanded, and sometimes you'll see that notated as a capital Q with a D subscript, and divided by the percentage change in price. And then as they go down through this, they start making some, in the text, they start making some general comments about price elasticity of demand. And one of the first ones they make is price elasticity of demand is generally a negative number. And why do you think is generally a negative number? Because go back and what did we talk about the law of demand? Anybody remember what we talked about the law of demand? As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. As price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Opposite relationships. So you would expect it to be a negative number. And the elasticity of demand, they talk about it's just a number. It doesn't have any relationship with units. You don't typically see units quoted with price elasticity of demand. You'll see negative 0.3, you'll see negative 5, you'll see negative 1 if it's unit elastic. But you don't see any units quoted when they talk about price elasticity of demand. And then the next observation they make is the number indicates how much quantity demanded changes for each 1% in the price. And then they follow on with that. If the change in price leads to a larger change in quantity demanded, then the price elasticity of demand is elastic. Make sense? If the change in price is smaller than the change in quantity demanded, then it's inelastic. If the change in price is equal to the change in quantity demanded, and that's where it talks about it's unit elastic. And unit elastic is usually -1. So you'll see -1. And a lot of economists, because it's just in general going to be a negative number, a lot of economists will drop the negative number and just use the absolute values. So 1 is going to be unit elastic. Anything with an absolute value of less than 1 is going to be inelastic. And if it's got an absolute value of greater than 1, it's going to be elastic. The text makes a comment about don't drop the negative. When I was in graduate school, one professor would, keep the negative sign. The next one would talk about absolute numbers. And I think it's as much as anything else, it's preference among not only the professors teaching the classes, but those individuals that are playing around with price elasticity of demand. And then they jump into and they talk about the 3 general categories of elasticity. And it says if elasticity of demand is less than -1. So think of a number that's going to be less than -1. 1.1, -1.1, -1.2, -2. All of those numbers are less than -1. But at the same vein, it's greater than 1 in absolute values. And that's where economists, if they're either dropping the negative sign or they're talking an absolute value, then it's elastic. Small percentage change in price leads to a larger percentage change in quantity demanded. And remember, think about this. This is a ratio. And so anytime you've got a ratio, if the number on the bottom, which is percentage change in price, is smaller than the number in the numerator, so your denominator is smaller than a number in the numerator, what's that ratio going to be? It's going to be greater than 1. And so that's where they talk about an absolute value. And then if the elasticity of demand is equal to 1 or equal to -1 or equal to 1 in absolute value, we talked about it's unit elastic. And that's a situation where the percentage change in price equals the percentage change in quantity demanded. 10% change in price, 10% change in quantity demanded. If the elasticity of demand is greater than -1, so it's going to be something greater than -1, it's going to be like -0.5. And if the absolute value is less than 1.5, then it's inelastic. And that means that a large percentage change in price leads to a smaller percentage change in quantity demanded. Again, think about your ratios. What's on the bottom is the denominator. What's on the top is the numerator, right? And which is the largest? If the numerator is larger than the denominator, it's going to be elastic. If the denominator is larger than the numerator, it's going to be inelastic. And if they're the same, it's going to be unilasticity. I've had students in class in the past that get really confused with elasticity. And it's actually, just think about it almost in terms of going back to algebra. Think about ratios. Think about, numerator bigger than the denominator bigger than the numerator. What happens if they're the same? And so if you keep that in mind, it probably makes elasticity probably will start to make some sense. And one thing that I had a professor in graduate school taught me, we were talking about percentage change in X, and he starts scribbling on the board, and it's basically the change in X divided by the initial change, and he keeps scribbling, and he says, it's basically the new value of X minus the initial value of X, get your change in X, and then the initial value of X. And at that point, that's your percentage change in X. And he said, but if you get confused, and again, we're talking about percentage change, he says, if you get confused, if you rearrange mathematical terms and take the denominator and break it into its two pieces, you have the new X divided by the initial X minus the initial X divided by the initial X. You remember, you're breaking that denominator apart. And he looked at the class and said, what does that mean? It's basically the ending value divided by the beginning value minus 1. And you don't have to stop and think about it. If you simplify it, and again, my major professor in graduate school, one of the things he gave me was that sign, and that sign that, I had me hanging over my desk in graduate school, and it was KISS. It was keep it simple, stupid. And as long as you can take these economic concepts and break them down into something that is somewhat simpler and easier to remember, it makes understanding economics a whole lot easier. One thing that they talk about in the text is the computation depends on where you start and where you finish. And if you go through their examples, it does make sense. And we're going to get into, in the second segment of this chapter, we're going to get into a way to kind of take care of that for you. But it does depend on, do you start here? Do you start there? When you're looking at your change, which one is your new value and which one is your old value? And then they also make the comment in the text that elasticity is not equal to the slope. They are sometimes related, but they're not identical. And if you go back to your algebra classes, what is the definition of slope of a line? It's the change in y, vertical, divided by the change in x, horizontal. Then same thing about percentage change. It just talks about the change in y divided by the change in x, and that gives you the slope of the line. And they continue harping on that elasticity is the percentage changes. It's the ratio of the percentage changes of quantity demanded divided by the price of the good or service. And the last thing I guess the last comment they make under the section that talks about PED is slope is constant on a linear demand curve, but the elasticity of demand will change. depending on where you are on that linear demand curve. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. That's going to kind of wind us up on the first segment. And when we come back, we're going to talk about arc elasticity. And I can remember the first time I was, heard the term arc elasticity. I thought it really sounded foreign to me. But after you work with arc elasticity for a while, you may find, again, my professors at Ohio State kept saying that when you're calculating price elasticity of demand, you probably want to always use arc elasticity formula, because the arc elasticity gives you a value or an estimate of the price elasticity of demand that better approximates reality. Because arc elasticity, and we'll get into it in a few minutes, doesn't care where you start, doesn't care which data points you use to calculate, and it's actually a very helpful tool. So that'll kind of wind it up for this segment, and we'll jump into arc elasticity when we come back. Talk to you soon.